Everybody, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 13th. So I hope at this point that you have put some closure onto your first paper. Thank you for those of you who have already submitted in your first paper. And as you know, my grading program works best with my email, so I'm asking that you send your first paper via PDF to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And I will review those papers next week, which happens to be spring break, by the way. And then we will proceed from there. Everybody has the option of rewriting the first paper. So once I evaluate it and return it back to you, if you're content with your grade, you're done. But if you wanted to do a revision for a higher grade, you can incorporate my comments and also contact me if you need further direction. And then I just ask that you submit in your revision along with the original copy that has my commentary on it, so I can compare and contrast the two. And you would have the higher of the two grades. And that would be due by the ending of the semester, but certainly the sooner you get it in, the better. And that I've got rolling deadlines with my papers, so the paper doesn't necessarily have to be submitted in on the 13th, but my hope is that it is submitted in today on the 13th if you are watching this video, because ultimately this puts us halfway through the semester, which happens to be a very nice, I think, and happy coincidence, because the next play that we will be addressing is Shakespeare. Shakespeare tends to lead to some challenges, which we will talk about after the break. So this gives you a little bit of extra time to read Shakespeare. And yes, we will watch a performance as well and talk about performance. But as you know, performance is never a substitute. It's merely a supplement for reading the play. But where we are is Oedipus the King, and we saw a performance of Oedipus the King that tried to duplicate what we might experience in a 430 BC situation in a Greek amphitheater. And while it certainly couldn't necessarily give us an exact sense, I do love how they were able to use things like color imagery to illustrate some of the major themes of the play, as well as use light and dark and shadow in order to illustrate vision and blindness, some of the major themes of the play. And Aristotle, a name you might be familiar with from philosophy, is also perhaps one of the first literary critics, because he identified what he considered to be the elements necessary for a great tragedy. And I assigned that as a reading. I couldn't find a link online, unfortunately. That's on page 1165. But I can't tell you what we're reading as a translation, obviously. And he talks about that the finest example of a tragedy, in his opinion, is a tragedy by the name of Oedipus the King. It's one of the reasons why we read Oedipus the King, because it's helped to establish the tragic tradition. And that according to Aristotle, tragedy should be complex. That makes sense. All literature should be complex. And that it should be terrible. After all, it's tragic, so horrible things should happen. And it should also be piteous. We should feel pity for the main character, who happens to be Oedipus the King. And the main character is called the tragic hero. And the tragic hero has certain elements associated with them. The first, that they are great individuals, above and beyond the ordinary, someone above and beyond ourselves. In other words, someone we respect and admire. And that if they can experience this kind of fall, our fall would be much greater, because they are superior to us. And they experience a downfall in part because of flaws in character. So there are errors that they make. That's part of the instructional element of the play, that we don't duplicate those errors. And the biggest error of all is usually hubris, excessive arrogance. And in this particular instance, we definitely see that with Oedipus. And this is one of the ways that the play is probably most challenging for contemporary audiences, is understanding how Greek society would have felt about arrogance in terms of the gods, note in the plural, that one should humbly accept one's fate from the gods. And Oedipus does not. And from our contemporary standpoint, we understand why. Who would want to accept such a horrible prophecy that they would kill their father and marry their mother? In fact, Oedipus takes action to prevent it. And the irony, and there's great irony in this play, is that in every action Oedipus takes to prevent the horrible tragedy from occurring, it just brings it about. And which leads to the question, if he had just humbly accepted his fate and not try to outwit the gods, would any of this have happened? And from a Greek perspective, he should have just humbly accepted his fate, that his major flaw of flaws was trying to usurp the gods, outwit the gods. And honestly, this is something that occurred before Oedipus. This occurred with Oedipus's birth parents, where they too try to change their fate. And by trying to change it, they actually bring it about. It almost reminds me of one of those science fiction or time travel stories that, can really mess with your head. If you kill your grandfather in the past, are you going to be born? That kind of thing. And also the kinds of Twilight Zone episodes, if you're a fan of the TV show The Twilight Zone, with the twist, ironic endings. But we'll never know for certain what would have happened if Oedipus and his birth parents had just accepted their fate. But what we're supposed to assume is that they're punished for trying to usurp the will of the gods. And the outside forces, those things that are beyond individual control. The language they use at this time is fate. We might call it luck. And religions and philosophies have tried to balance the two. How do you find a way to acknowledge that individual action can change future, but there are quantifiable unknowns outside of our control, whether you call it luck or destiny or fate. And this is one of the reasons why we feel pity. We're supposed to feel pity for the tragic hero. Not only are they a great individual who's trying to do the right thing, but also some of it is beyond their control. Yes, some of it is in their control, and that's the lesson to us. Don't engage in the flaw or flaws of the tragic hero. And Oedipus has quite a few of them. For instance, excessive anger. The idea that he slays everybody on the crossroads. Note that it's a it's a crossroads where three roads met. 3 is so significant because it represents Oedipus's birth family. Oedipus and Laius and Jocasta, all 3 of them. I had a student once say that this was perhaps the earliest literary example of road rage, and perhaps that might help us understand why Oedipus so overreacted. But obviously temper is part of Oedipus's flaws in character. So is denial. He refuses to see the truth, hence the theme of vision and blindness. Everybody figures it out before Oedipus. It's one of the reasons why it's important that we know the plot of the play before Oedipus himself, so that we can understand all of the irony. Oedipus rejects the words of the seer Tiresias, a blind prophet, again to illustrate irony, that you don't need to have physical eyesight in order to have insight. Oedipus has physical sight, but yet he has no insight. More ironic because Oedipus has established himself as a great riddle solver, which is how he got to the kingdom in the first place, in that he solved the riddle of the Sphinx. And the riddle being what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 3 in the evening. Answer being man, 4 legs in the morning being a baby crawling, 2 in the afternoon would be an adult walking, 3 in the evening, and that would be an elderly person with a cane. But of course, Oedipus actually fulfills his own riddle because he's not necessarily elderly, but he is blind. So he needs a seeing eye stick. He needs a cane in effect. So he walks off on 3 legs. But the tragic hero, regardless of their flaw or flaws in character, they ultimately will accept responsibility. And this is also another way that it's perhaps very difficult for a contemporary audience to understand why Oedipus would gouge out his eyes. Jocasta commits suicide when she finds out the truth. At the time, that would be seen as the cowardly way out, that she's unwilling to face the truth of the horrors that she has helped to bring about. So Oedipus is going to live with pain. And Not only does he punish himself, but he gouges out his eyes because his eyes in many ways have betrayed him. Notice this idea of vision and blindness again. Now Oedipus has become much like Tiresias. He doesn't have physical sight, but he does have insight. He's got the truth. So that works very nicely thematically in the way that Oedipus punishes himself. And we as audience feel pity because Oedipus was a good person and tried to prevent things again, but that's probably the hardest part, again, to wrap our minds around, is that perhaps if he hadn't tried to prevent things, it never would have happened. But we certainly know that Oedipus will unravel the truth, even to his own detriment. Never does he really believe that that will happen, but that's what happens. When Jocasta finally figures things out, and in the production, you can pretty easily identify when she's made the connection through her body language. Doesn't necessarily have to be that way from the written text, so that was a directorial decision. But her response is, Oedipus, stop asking questions. In other words, Jocasta is willing to sacrifice the well-being of the community and allow them to die in plague than to have her own nuclear family compromised. And that's why she can never be a tragic hero. Just like the fact that she commits suicide and she doesn't accept responsibility. Oedipus puts the fate of the community above his own. And the community would be seen as a kind of extended family, and that a good ruler would put the community above themselves. So that's also part of the lessons of the play, is what does it mean to be a good ruler. So we as audience feel pity for this tragic hero, and also fear that if they could fall and they're so much superior to us, can you imagine how far we could fall? And Oedipus is superior. First of all, he's a king, and most of us are not royalty. Secondly, he's a great riddle solver. He solved the riddle of the Sphinx that nobody else could solve. And he's a good man. And he wants to do what's best for his kingdom and for his community, even if that means that he himself is going to suffer. Not that he ever really believes that that's going to be the case, but to his credit, when he finds out that he does have to suffer, he's willing to accept that suffering. And Aristotle continued and talked about how the characters should be necessary and probable. They should be as realistic as possible, based with the limitations, of course, with drama. We know we're watching something that's fictional. So that's one of the reasons why we still read Oedipus the King, is because of its historical importance in establishing the criteria of drama. Aristotle also talked about the importance of something called the unities, that we should try as much as possible to make a realistic drama, understanding that what we're watching is fictional. So it should take place in real time, approximately 2 to 3 hours, because that's the length of the play we're watching. It shouldn't take place over weeks or months or years, or even multiple hours. So it should keep to the unity of time. It should also keep to the unity of place. Once we've established a locale, Athens, for instance, we stay there. And we shouldn't show anything on stage that is improbable. So, for instance, if you're going to have a monster like the Sphinx, and the Sphinx doesn't exist, you can talk about it, but you don't show it on stage. And if you are going to have something like a suicide, you can talk about it, but you're not going to show that on stage. You can't have a character literally kill themselves. And if you're going to have someone gouge out their eyes, again, you can talk about it, but you can't show that on stage. And notice how Oedipus follows all of those criteria as well. Another reason why we read Oedipus is because of Sigmund Freud, and you might be familiar with his Oedipal complex. And Freud was very loosely inspired by Oedipus the King to name one of his theories the Oedipal complex, after Oedipus. And if you know anything about Freud, you'll know that his theory in the Oedipal complex is that sons are romantically attracted to their mothers and see their fathers as competition. There's another complex that Freud has called the Electra complex, and the argument is that daughters are attracted to their fathers romantically and see their mothers as competition. Obviously, the Freud Oedipal complex is not what happens with Oedipus the King. It's not that Oedipus wants to be with his mother. In fact, he does everything he can to try to avoid it, and ironically, he brings it to fruition. But you can see how some of the ideas of being with one's parent or engaging in patricide might have inspired Freud to come up with the Oedipal complex. So that's another reason why this play is important. And the third, some of the timeless and universal themes. And while Oedipus might seem outlandish, and no, we no longer live in a world of prophecy or gods, the questions of fate versus free will. How much control do we have over our lives, and how much is either planned out for us, fated, predestined, or predetermined? And or perhaps there's just foreknowledge and we have free will, but it's just some higher entity knows what's going to happen before it happens. Religions and philosophies have tried to answer this question, and certainly Oedipus the King does as well. And as we had talked about, it was originally written in the Greek, so we can't necessarily know the exact wording word for word. We're reading the play more holistically in terms of its themes. And the plot would be known by the audience, so that ultimately the audience wouldn't have to rely on a performance, which would be tricky. Again, the performance we saw gave us lots of close-ups, so we were able to see everything and see how exaggerated things looked. Imagine if we were in a Greek amphitheater all the way in the last row. We would just see little dots. And what we would see at one point was an innovation for drama. 3 major characters on stage at the same time. Oedipus, Jocasta, and Creon. This was revolutionary because usually there were only 2 characters to reduce the possibility of getting characters mixed up. Even though they had these large padded costumes and platform shoes and masks, it would still be fairly difficult to see them, especially if we were way back in the amphitheater. But in this instance, you can see how Sophocles is beginning to expand the definition of drama and give us a good amount of complexity, at least based on the dramas beforehand. So, this tragic hero as Oedipus is, and you can see in the notes below that he's royalty, he's a great riddle solver, and he's concerned with the populace. And experiences a downfall. Oh, there's lots of downfall in this play. Plague, for instance. Incest. Oedipus loses his kingdom. The outside forces are the fated prophecy. Oedipus's flaw or flaws in character. Where do we begin? There's that hubris and excessive pride and trying to outwit the gods. There's his anger that seems uncontrollable, not just with slaying somebody who's blocking his way in a crossroads, but he threatens Creon, his brother-in-law, and he tells Creon that he believes that Creon is trying to steal the kingdom from him, showing his paranoia. Oedipus is paranoia as well, and Creon says, well, why would I want your kingdom? Got all the benefits of being king without any of the responsibilities. Oedipus is threatening people with death. And notice that Creon at the end, who didn't want to become king, becomes king. How's that for irony? And yet shows mercy to Oedipus in a way that Oedipus would never show mercy to Creon. Oedipus that threatened Creon with death. Notice how Creon doesn't kill Oedipus, but he exiles Oedipus. And of course, the denial, again, one of the ways that perhaps this play has contemporary significance is that we oftentimes don't want to see what's right in front of us. We're deliberately blind to the truth. So Oedipus eventually accepts responsibility, gouging out his eyes and accepting exile. And unlike Jocasta, who commits suicide, in the audience, we feel pity for Oedipus. Wasn't all his fault. And also fear. This can happen to Oedipus. It can happen to us. And I must admit, I always read this play wrong. I'm always looking for the loophole. That if Oedipus hadn't killed anybody, if Oedipus hadn't married anybody, you get the idea, then perhaps he could have prevented this. But I'm engaging in the same sin that Oedipus was, which is trying to outwit the gods. And if Oedipus could fall so much, and he's so superior to me in doing that, can you imagine what my fall would be? And one of the moral lessons is that we shouldn't engage in Oedipus's flaws. Notice how these characters don't have a lot of depth to them in the way that we see with contemporary dramas. Jocasta, very much represents the non-tragic hero, not concerned with the populace and not accepting responsibility for her role. Creon represents reason, rationality, generosity. Now, Oedipus is part of a trilogy. There are 3 dramas. The second, I believe, is included in your textbook. And the second is called Antigone, which happens to be the story of Oedipus's daughter as an adult years have gone by. Creon is still king, but he's a very different kind of king than the kind of character that he was in Oedipus. Rather than being reasonable and rational and generous, Creon is the opposite in the second play, Antigone. Creon is unreasonable, irrational, selfish. In fact, he's very much like Oedipus is in the first play, which leads to the question, what does the position of rule do to an individual? Which you might have heard posed as, what does absolute power do? Does it corrupt absolutely? The third play, because there is a third one, I don't think it's included in your textbook, but you could find them easily enough online if you wanted to. Oedipus at Colonus. We revisit Oedipus now as an old man. He's been wandering in exile for years, again with his stick, his walking stick, his cane. The question is, has he atoned for his sins? Have the gods forgiven him? And I won't tell you, you have to read or watch the play to find out. We know that Tiresias represents the epitome of irony. He's physically blind, but yet he has insight. And think about how absurd Oedipus is. At one point, he even says, it seems that the seer can see. And of course the seer can see. He's a seer. But Oedipus doesn't want to accept any truth unless it helps to reinforce Oedipus's own version of truth. The chorus, which helps to amplify volume when you've got multiple people chanting the same lines. It almost serves as providing a soundtrack because they sound so musical. But the chorus can serve as the populace, the extras in a movie, if you will. So they are reacting to what's happening. But they can also serve as narrator, and they can comment on the action itself. They can also reiterate things. Some of the many themes in the play are things like vision and blindness, light and dark, irony. And of course, we have the ability to talk about tragic hero in this play as exemplified by a great individual who experiences a fall because of flaws, outside forces, accepts responsibility, and the audience feels pity and fear. And I can tell you right now that this is a definition that's used to this day for tragedy, where you have dramatists who are either following this definition or they are tweaking it to adapt to contemporary times. And an author you've probably heard of before, Shakespeare, does this with his most famous plays, which are probably his tragedies. Othello, Macbeth, King Lear. Notice that all of these plays are named after great individuals who are above and beyond the ordinary, who experience falls. The way that Shakespeare would tweak the definition would be whether or not these people accept responsibility. So if you know Macbeth, for instance, that's a major question. Does Macbeth ever really accept responsibility? From contemporary times, I had a professor in college who argued that the play Death of a Salesman, if you've ever read that play, then you are familiar with its main character, Willy Loman, who's indeed a low man. That he is our new definition of a great individual who experiences a fall, because you don't have to be great in the sense of being a king or in contemporary times or having unusual intelligence. For us to truly be moved by the drama, you should be a low man, an ordinary individual. And Willy Loman is just a guy who's struggling to pay his mortgage and basically have a little bit of respect from his family. So that's been the argument with more contemporary pieces. If you are familiar with the television series Breaking Bad, which I highly recommend that you watch if you haven't already done so, then you might see that Walter White, the main character, is really also a contemporary retelling of a tragic hero, of somebody who experiences a downfall. So this formula is something that you can see in a lot of contemporary works as well. But there's so many themes and there's so many quotes that you can follow, whether it's vision and blindness or light and dark or irony or fate or free will or family or quotation. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of Oedipus the King. As I said, I hope that at this point you are thinking about the next play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. I'm going to include a link for that so that you can begin your readings, but it's also included in the textbook. And we will, of course, watch performance for that as well. And next week we are on spring break. I will be posting that on our Moodle site. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on after we return from spring break. Take care. Bye bye.